Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Daniel Monaghan, the Policy Officer here at the Co-operative Party, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all this evening. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on the future of affordable and cooperative housing in the UK. And we'll be discussing how a new Labour and cooperative government can really increase the affordability of housing and grow the cooperative housing sector right across the nations and regions of the UK. Just really quickly, before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to go through a few tips on how we can make this more interactive for everyone. So for those who are hard of hearing, we are working with the RNID to live caption this event. If you want to view these captions, you simply need to enable them yourself by pressing the CC icon on the bottom tools panel of your phone or computer. This Zoom call is also being recorded, as many of our members can't access it live. So it's going to be available on the Co-operative Party's YouTube channel. So if you don't want your image seen, then just turn off your video and go to audio only. Finally, in order to prevent disruptions, only those speaking will have their sound enabled. After we've heard from tonight's speakers, we're going to move to a Q&A session as normal. And there's two ways you can ask a question. The first is by popping any question you may have in the chat box, and we'll come to you. And then the second one is by raising your virtual hand, and we'll let you know when it's your turn to speak. Finally, please bear in mind the cooperative values and principles when you're contributing, so make sure everyone feels welcome and respected as part of this call. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for this evening. The first is Blase Lambert, the Chief Executive of the Confederation of Co-operative Housing, and the second is Rachel Blake, the Vice Chair of Labour Housing Group and the prospective parliamentary candidate for the cities of London and Westminster. So I'll pass over to yourself, Blase.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and evening, everybody. Very nice to see so many faces, even if they're very small on my screen, but nice to see you all. So I'm going to just screen share the presentation slides that I've got that I'm just going to run through fairly briefly. Before obviously looking forward to taking any questions from yourselves when we get round to that bit. So yes, I'm Blase Lambert. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Confederation of Co-operative Housing. We are the UK's representative body for housing cooperatives and have been since our inception in 1992. We're a federal member of Cooperatives UK and a founding member of Community-Led Homes, which is a joint venture between ourselves, the CLT network, locality and UK co-housing. We have 200 member cooperatives across the UK. Our smallest has one house with 4 people living in it. Our largest is a good deal larger than that. Indeed, we have just around about 196,000 homes within our membership. 3 key aims that we've got. Why do we exist as an organisation? Well, unsurprisingly, to promote viable forms of cooperative, mutual and community-led housing is sort of the #1 top of the list, but also we provide a lot of support, advice, services and information to organisations to assist them in enhancing their governance and to help them deliver excellent services to their tenants. And we provide networking opportunities for our members and partner organisations through an annual conference, webinar events, regional forums, and etc. And in addition to being CCH's Chief Executive, I'm also the Treasurer of Cooperative Housing International, which is the ICA's, the International Cooperative Alliance's sector body for housing. And I'm also a board member of the International Cooperative Alliance as well. I represent the sectors on the ICA's board. So where did it all start with housing and co-ops in the UK? Well, it all started in New Lanark with Robert Owen, and here's a shot that I took when I was up there recently. Unsurprisingly, the Rochdale Pioneers had something to do with the history of housing cooperatives in the UK. Indeed, their original rule book stated that they existed to, amongst other things, build a number of homes in which those members desiring to assist each other in improving their domestic and social conditions may reside. In other words, one of the founding principles of the Rochdale Pioneers was to build affordable housing to deal with slum housing conditions in mill towns in central Lancashire. The picture across Europe is very different. In Sweden, 1 in 3 homes are owned and managed and developed by housing co-ops. In Austria, it's 40% of all homes. In the UK, it's quite a bit smaller than that. And the reason for that essentially is different post-war housing policies that were pursued in different parts of Western Europe, where governments legislated strongly to support and enable and promote cooperative housing. There are very substantial cooperative housing sectors. In countries like the UK, where we made different choices, the sector is significantly smaller. And really, the story of housing cooperatives in the UK starts to gain momentum when Reg Friesen, who was the housing minister in Harold Wilson's 1974 government, created the first enabling legislation and funding programme to support housing cooperatives across the UK. And in a short period of time, several hundred housing cooperatives, in fact, nearly 500 housing cooperatives came into existence with support from the government at that time. So I suppose, you know, question number one, what could a future Labour and cooperative government do to assist the growth of the sector? Well, look back to what it did in the 1970s when it assisted the growth of the sector from pretty much scratch to a very strong position with cooperatives across the country and a national network of secondary cooperatives providing development and management services to them. The second wave of cooperative housing in the UK came about following the 1994 right to manage regulations being introduced for local authority tenants. This gave rights to tenants on local authority estates to set up their own management cooperatives, of which there are currently 250 of those managing more than 100,000 homes across the country. And the third wave has come about in recent years as a byproduct of the current government's support for the community-led housing sector. And indeed, it's alongside that from 2015 onwards that Labour mayors in London and Manchester particularly, Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham, have put funding and support strongly behind the growth of community and cooperative housing in those areas. And again, something that we can build on moving forward. Some quick examples. There is no standard housing co-op, as you will see from the pictures I'm showing you and about to show you. They come in all shapes and form. Top left is a row of terraces that were refurbished following the 1981 riots in Liverpool. Top right is a development that the housing co-op I lived in for many years in Kilburn completed, which was a refurbishment of a rather large derelict block known as Kilburn House. Bottom left is part of the Coin Street development on the south bank of the Thames. That's the Oxo Tower. The Redwood Housing Cooperative forms the intermediate 4 floors of that development. There's retail on the ground, there's art galleries, there's also a rather nice restaurant on the top floor as well. And the bottom right is Homes for Change in Manchester, created in partnership with the Guinness Trust as part of the Hume Regeneration, late 80s and into the early 90s. Very innovative scheme, and also contains not just a housing cooperative on site, but also cooperative cafe, workspace. Indeed, Work for Change Cooperative manages all of the workspace and business units there, and it's more of a hybrid example of where housing can be part of a broader mix of activity, in the same way that the Coin Street example is not limited just to housing. Those were examples from the 80s and the 90s of what the sector created. More recently, the sector has been creating some new schemes across different types of cooperative type and tenure. Top left is the Lilac Mutual Home Ownership Society in Leeds, low impact living with affordable equity staircasing for residents, where the payments that they make are linked to the income that they have. Top right is the Edinburgh Student Housing Cooperative. That's one of the 2 halls of residence that the student cooperative that came into existence in Edinburgh is managing. Bottom left is Forge Bank, which is a co-housing scheme developed on the banks of the River Lune, just outside Lancaster. And bottom right is an extra care scheme created by Phoenix Community Housing in Lewisham, Phoenix being a community gateway stock transfer that took place about 20 years ago in Lewisham, but they've recently developed this this extra care scheme for members of the society. A couple of our award winners, just to highlight for you. This is Bunker Housing Cooperative, leading Brighton's housing co-op renaissance. This is a self-build scheme on land made available by the local authority, with, it should be noted, financial support provided through the Public Works Loan Board, in partnership with the City Council there, and a loan stock issue drawing funds from existing cooperatives in other parts of the country as investors in this scheme. And they won our award for Breakthrough Housing Cooperative of the Year this year. Next up, our award for Innovative Housing Cooperative Project of the Year. This was awarded to North Camden Housing Co-op for their full environmental redesign and renovation on a 3-storey 15-unit building here in central London. This is the first of many projects that we are expecting to see rolling forward within the sector in terms of retrofit, in terms of greening our properties ready for the net zero or reaching the net zero challenge that's presented to us over the coming years. Very quickly wanted to introduce you also to Wayshaper, which is our options planning toolkit that we created for communities looking to set up new housing cooperative projects. It takes them through all of the options that are available to them at the various stages of the development process, from initial idea to moving into the homes. Wayshaper, I should say, has also gained a fair deal of traction and interest in other countries with housing cooperators in other countries, and we're at the moment in development for the Wayshaper Sustainable Development Goals tool that will sit alongside this, enabling communities to consider how they embed the Sustainable Development Goals into their future plans and aspirations. So what could a future Labour and cooperative government nationally do to assist in the growth of the sector? Well, 3 things first up that I think are absolute prerequisites that we don't have at the moment, that where in other countries there are strong and successful cooperative housing sectors, these exist. Firstly is a bespoke and distinct form of tenure for cooperatives. In the UK, we have bespoke forms of tenure for council housing. We have them for housing associations. We have assured short-hold tenancy frameworks for the private rental sector. We have no cooperative tenure. It doesn't exist as a legal form. So legislation creating and enabling a cooperative tenure would mean that we stand on our own legal footing rather than trying to adapt to legal frameworks that are established to suit different forms of tenure, and a much more feudalistic approach, shall we say, to landlord and tenant relationships. Secondly is appropriate financial mechanisms. That's not just grant and revenue funding to enable development, but it's also the financial mechanisms that allow capital to flow into schemes. In Switzerland, for example, the bond issuing cooperative in Switzerland, which is a joint venture between the national representative organisation there and the Swiss government, has enabled 30,000 new homes to be developed by housing cooperatives in a decade. Essentially, the Swiss government acts as a guarantor for the cooperative sector, and with the creditworthiness of the Swiss government standing behind the sector, this has brought extremely cheap finance into developing cooperatives in that country. And thirdly is an appropriate regulatory environment. Again, we operate within a regulatory environment that is either designed for large housing associations and their corporate governance structures, or is intended for non-housing based organisations. In addition to that, I think legislation to create a presumption in favour of cooperative housing in land use would be extremely useful. Again, that sort of legislation exists in other European countries where the sector is able to take advantage of that presumption in favour. action to assist the leveraging of current social housing assets to develop new housing cooperatives, whether that's the assets of the existing cooperative housing sector or more broadly, the extremely large sums of money that we have invested into the balance sheets of housing associations in this country could be put to work much more usefully for the benefit of communities and for the benefit of the cooperative sector more broadly. And also alongside that would be action taken to restrict some of the pressures that we feel in other directions caused by speculative real estate investment in this country. I mean, London, for example, is just about the top of the list go-to place for international money to rest in real estate, land and property. And whilst recently restrictions have been placed on certain flows from Russia coming into London and Manchester and other parts of the UK to push up property prices and hold land, that is only the tip of the iceberg. And locally, councillors and members could be working to ensure that local authorities have supportive housing policies that enable cooperatives to flourish within their areas. Provide access to land that is in the ownership or control of local authorities, and also, as in the example of Bunker Housing Cooperative, provide financial support through loan capital drawn down on the Public Works Loan Board. That's me. I hope you've enjoyed that very whistle-stop tour through the history and the present and perhaps the future of the cooperative housing sector in the UK. And I'll hand back to Daniel now.
Thanks very much, Blase. Yeah, as you say, that was a brilliant whistle-stop tour and provided an example of how Labour and cooperative representatives nationally and locally can drive forward the growth of the sector. So really exciting stuff there. Now I'm going to pass over to Rachel to speak and provide her thoughts, and then we'll open up to a Q&A. So I'm just going to ask Rachel to unmute. I can't see her at the moment. Where are you? Oh, there you are.
Great. Can you hear me okay now? Great. Well, thanks very much for having me. As Daniel said, my name is Rachel Blake. I'm the Vice Chair of the Labour Housing Group. I'm also Labour and Co-op candidate in the cities of London and Westminster. And I'm also a CLP member of the Labour Party's National Housing Forum. And I've been delighted to speak to Daniel about some of the policy discussions and policy ideas that the Co-operative Party can be thinking about in terms of our approach to cooperative housing policies. I don't have a presentation, but I wanted to break down my remarks into three particular sections. The first is about the supply of housing. The second is about the rights of tenants and residents. The third is about governance. So in terms of supply, obviously the supply of new homes, obviously Blase has given us a really thoughtful and thorough presentation on the options for increasing the overall supply of cooperative and affordable homes. I think it's useful to think about different approaches to both rented cooperative homes and owned cooperative homes. We know that in terms of community land trust models, they're mostly focused on an owned option, but there are ways of financing a rented option that I think are worth considering. And the other thing that came through really strongly in Blase's presentation is about the art of the possible. We know a lot of this is already happening at a local level in the first place, and it's worth really getting into some of the detail about how to support that going forward. And that's to do with really strong co-op values of local activism and locally driving some of these initiatives. In terms of planning policy, Blase talked about an approach that you can have in both local and then national housing policy around supporting cooperative models. I think once you have a requirement, so planning requirements around affordable housing don't specify whether or not it needs to be a cooperative tenure or not, they specify more rent levels. And so at the moment there is already that opportunity for there to be co-op rent or owned models, because it's established by rent, but that doesn't mean that the sector can't keep innovating with its own approaches to delivery. And then, of course, in terms of supply, what's really needed is a significant investment in supply across affordable rented and then affordable home ownership. And one of those methods and one of those models is community land trusts and cooperative owned homes as well. That's around those are the big themes around the supply of homes. In terms of rights and tenants and residents' rights, I think the cooperative movement has a really strong role in terms of supporting tenants with their activism and supporting tenants to come together as residents' associations to secure action, whether or not that's on individual repairs, communal repairs, community action and community investment of housing associations, but also of local authorities and organising themselves also when they're in leasehold accommodation as well. I think there's already examples of where that's been really powerful, but there's certainly things that need to change as well on that front in terms of a commitment around housing as a human right, and that's something that I think the co-op movement would be supportive of, but also demonstrates a grassroots approach as well to housing rights. And then finally, in terms of the governance of the sector, at the moment, the regulation of housing associations, overall consumer regulation of housing in terms of repairs and maintenance is very weak. There's been recognition of this by the government with plans for a new social housing regulation bill coming forward, but I think this is a huge opportunity for cooperators and the cooperative movement to make a very strong case, for example, on tenants and residents on boards of housing association, tenants and resident activism, and involvement in management and design of services, and really becoming more involved in the overall management of those spaces and support of those spaces as well. And I think in the current legislation going forward only goes so far, and there's a huge opportunity going forward in terms of Labour and co-op policy making about that community involvement and tenants and residents as being part of management organisations. So my remarks were very brief in order that we can get on to a Q&A.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button there. As you quite rightly say, coming on to the Q&A for everyone. So I see we've got an initial few questions coming in. One from Cecile, one from Jim, and then there was one from Pauline in the chat, which I'll ask you to read out in a moment, Pauline. So if we start with Cecile and then Jim, and then we'll have Pauline's. We'll go back to Blase and Rachel, and then we'll go to another set of questions after the initial three. So I'll just ask yourself to unmute there, Cecile. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to both Blase and Rachel for their informative presentations, and I'm still distilling quite a bit of it. But what I wanted to do, I'm Professor Cecile Wright. I'm a member of the BAME network for the Co-operative Party. I'm a former chair of that network. What I wanted to raise, lots of things I wanted to raise, but I wanted to bring two concepts and notion: housing as a human rights, and the scope for involving communities and activists in the whole housing sector, which I think ought to be central in terms of putting together forthcoming regulation for ensuring that houses are maintained and habitable. Now, it's interesting with Blase going through the involvement of the pioneers, the Rochdale Pioneers, in terms of housing and the attempts to build affordable housing to deal with slum housing at that time. It's quite paradoxical that we experience a major housing issue and health issue in Rochdale involving a toddler. in Rochdale, 2-year-old child, Ababe Ishak in Rochdale, who died in 2020 because he was exposed to mold in the family flat, and as a consequence of that, he died. And that is just the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately, in terms of housing and health. So I would want to know, how do we extend the involvement of the Cooperative Housing Federation in housing to ensure that there are more affordable housing, so that we don't have these crisis defining moments relating to housing and health, and ensuring that we exemplify housing as a human right? Thank you. Sorry, it's a bit long-winded.
No problem at all, Cecile. Thank you very much for that question. I'll just come to Jim now to ask yourself.
Okay, indeed. Thanks, Chair. Thanks to the speakers as well. And indeed, with regard to the co-op housing and our housing federation, what is your views on in-house maintenance for the properties, electricians, and in fact joiners, to maintain the properties, and also to ensure that we can actually implement modern insulation? So it's basically to have our own in-house staff that would service and maintain the properties. If it's a very small housing association, perhaps other ones, they could actually pool the workforce within a small geographical area, so that it's all the actual work in housing associations is actually in-house, that we're giving employment indeed to local people and ensuring apprenticeship training. So it's just basically on that aspect as well, that to ensure that we actually keep as many of the jobs and the work in-house, and with the local communities, they have in-house workers, maintenance teams for the housing. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm just going to come to one of the questions in the chat. The first one provides a really good question on how can we put forward cooperative alternatives to supported living housing options for people with physical disabilities, learning disabilities, and older people. So if I just come back to our two speakers now on those three questions we've just received. So I'll pass over to Rachel to go first, and then Blase, do you want to come in after?
Okay.
Apologies.
In case there's a delay, when I try to press unmute, it says you're not allowed to unmute. So I am trying.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
I'll pin you. I think that might help.
No worries. So to Cecile's question about housing as a human right, specifically around tenants involvement and representation, I think one of the reasons that the Social Housing Regulation Bill has come forward is in relation to the tragedy at Grenfell, in terms of residents not being listened to, and because residents of Grenfell had been saying and seeking repairs and investment in that block, and calling for further investigations prior to the tragedy at Grenfell. And the Social Housing Regulation Bill has come forward to recognise some of the issues that took place, so some of the barriers to that recognition, I believe. And then one of the things that I think will make a real difference is having tenants and residents involved directly in the governance of housing associations. You've already got the opportunity for tenants to be involved in scrutinies in local authorities, and I think it's really important part of tenant representation, but other forms are really supporting tenants and residents associations for councils and housing associations to take a proactive approach with tenant and resident engagement, specifically around individual repairs, but also communal repairs. I think one of the other areas where for housing to become a human right is in homelessness legislation, where I think where we should where there hasn't traditionally been a large, where the current legislation is focused around several different strands of definitions of being homeless, and so the difference would be made for housing to become a human right in terms of how our homelessness legislation is written. In terms of Jim's question, I was being kicked in and out of the Zoom meeting, I'm afraid, but I think that it was about again about in-house repairs services. Is that right, Daniel?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so again, I think that in terms of the cooperative movement, I think that comes down to there being the opportunity for tenants and residents to be involved in the scrutiny of those services, whether or not that's through tenant panels, being part of the review of the quality of both individual but also communal repairs, but also the overall governance of housing associations, and also the structures of housing repair services within local authorities. I think there's already space where within local authority structures around scrutiny committees where you can welcome tenants onto those to be involved in how those services are overseen. And then finally, in terms of the question about was it resident involvement for those with learning disabilities and older people, Daniel?
Yeah, it was like a cooperative provision for that. So how can we put cooperative alternatives to supported housing provision?
Okay.
Oh, and Pauline, I can see I'll just let her come in. She wants to ask the question. So
Okay.
please unmute, Pauline.
Yeah, just to clarify, this came up as something I live in one area, but I actually, and I'm a candidate, Labour and cooperative candidate in Colchester City now, but I work for Suffolk County Council, which is a true blue Tory council. But the thing is that they, like all other local authorities, are struggling to get with a shortage of placements for people with physical disabilities, learning disabilities, and older people who could live semi-independently but are having to go into care homes because there's not suitable homes for them. Ideally, these want to be about 4 people living in a converted house or block of housing or whatever, where they can have carers come into them and they can live their own lives. Now, this is part of the care in the community. This is what the people want. This is what their families want. Like, we don't want to put people with physical and learning disabilities into blocks where people treat them really badly. You know, we've had so many of those, Cheshire West, and we've had another one recently. But really, if we can find a way of producing an option that we can try and give to councils, even Tory councils, I think they'll bite our hands off, and I think that is going to be good for people. It's going to be a good housing association type option, and it's also going to create those sort of things that we want for people with disabilities. Thank you.
Rachel, did you want to have any final points, and then I'll pass over to Blase?
Well, I think just on that point specifically, I think there are practical solutions at the moment that are available, but one of the big barriers is the funding of those kinds of approaches, and then also the regulation of those kinds of approaches. And I would love to go away and do a bit more research and perhaps come back to Pauline in terms of the organisations that are already delivering that type of approach and what barriers they have come across in terms of delivery, but also how they've been able to overcome those and what practical solutions they've come up with. So if it's okay with you, Daniel, I'd love to go away and gather a few more thoughts about how to expand that approach, because I can think of a couple of examples that I'd like to share with Pauline in a bit more detail. I'm sorry, I'm having real technology challenges at the moment. In case I've gone all blurry, I don't know whether I have for you as well.
I have a little, but these things happen. No problem at all. Oh, yeah, you're back to normal now.
Okay.
Blase, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I wanted to make a starting distinction. Look, a housing association is a provider of social and affordable housing that is governed by essentially boards of directors made up predominantly of people that don't live in the homes and quite often have never lived in the homes. We have had tenant representatives on the boards of these organisations for more than 20 years. That doesn't drive the cultural change that is necessary in these organisations. A housing cooperative by distinct nature is owned by and governed by the people that actually live in the homes. And it's a bit like the difference between asking somebody who owns their own home whether they'd like to make decisions about running their own home or have somebody else 50 miles down the road making those decisions for them. In terms of involving communities, resident panels, residents associations, I didn't say earlier on that CCH, my organisation, has just been awarded a contract by the government to lead and deliver the new resident opportunities and empowerment programme over the next 2.5 years, which we're really looking forward to delivering. And we're looking to move to a situation that enables and empowers the 4 million people that live in social housing in this country, rather than what has happened over the last 3 decades very much, which is about creating structures that enable very, very small numbers of people to have influence and voice, but not very large numbers of people. And I'm very pleased that we're going to be leading on that work over the coming years. In terms of health and housing, I think, the key issue here around damp and mould is about cultural change. These are not new issues. They've been going on in council housing and housing association housing for decades now. And the culture of the sector, the people working within it, is to turn the tenant round and show them the door and tell them that it's their fault. And we have to change that culture. And again, that's about more than just putting a tenant on a board or allowing a few tenants to come along and scrutinise some overall statistics at the high end of it. It's about real cultural change within organisations and a different way of the people that work in the sector delivering services to people, empathising with the people that live in their homes. In terms of affordable housing, I would say that, whilst we can have targets for building affordable housing, unless there is presumption for community-led approaches, all we will get is more of the same. Because as long as large housing associations can go to the markets and borrow at much lower interest rates than communities are able to, they will continue to get the land, they will continue to build the homes, and nothing will really change. This is why the current government's community rights didn't work. Community right to buy, community right to build, take over your local pub. Yeah, but you get 6 months to come up with a business plan and to raise the finance. And where are you getting the money from as a new startup? The in-house maintenance point is really interesting because, virtually every local authority in this country used to have a DLO, a direct labour organisation. That's how we used to do this. And then we got compulsory competitive tendering. And then successive governments of all type pushed this sector further and further down the route of procurement, of best value, of outsourcing, so that all these contracts are decentralised and delivered by the same very, very small number of very large organisations that have no focus at the local level, that take money out of communities, that don't create employment opportunities and growth at the local level. And finally, in terms of the supported living question, I mean, it's very much what I was talking about at the start of my presentation. The models exist. They do this in other countries. What needs to change is the public policy, the availability of finance, the access to land, the enabling legislation, and a regulatory framework and environment that works to enable communities to take control of their own destinies. And I'd very much welcome the opportunity to have a broader discussion at a later stage with Rachel about what some of that could look like, because again, this is being done in other countries. It's just about learning what works elsewhere and adapting it to a UK situation.
Thanks very much, Blase. I'm going to ask for Jeanette, Ros and Richard to come in now. Jeanette.
All right. I just wanted to ask a question of Blase. Blase, you mentioned the community-led housing, I think it's bunker housing co-op in Brighton, where there's a couple of houses with another 15 in the pipeline, and the funding for that seemed to come from the Public Works Loan Board. But Daniel, you were at the Co-op Party South East Conference in Gillingham a couple of weeks ago, and Lloyd Russell Moyle mentioned small gap sites that could be available for co-op housing. I mean, these are sites that, a council wouldn't otherwise use in terms of the land. I mean, is there an option for councils to almost gift these small sites to co-op housing? You're not talking huge numbers, but if you can get 15, 20 housing on a gap site, it would solve some of the problems in a community.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Just before we come back, Blase, I'll just take Ros and then Richards, and then we'll respond. We'll come back to yourselves. Ros?
Yeah, I've got three comments to make. One's a comment and the others are two questions. The first comment is, please, what do we mean by affordable housing? Because it has no credibility as a term at all for most people, because affordable to whom is the big question. The second question is, I belong to a housing association which is has got progressively bigger and bigger and bigger, and more distant from its tenants. And is what is happening with the co-op, is the work that the co-op going to be able to do, going to be able to help us with that, or do we have to completely shift? Are we going to be able to get help from the cooperative society about that? That's one question. The other question is, last night in the Labour Party in my Labour Party meeting, we were considering the report that's just been produced by the Wealth Chain Project at Kingston University about tax haven money in London's real estate. And I mean, my plea would be that actually planners should, tax havens investors shouldn't be allowed to buy property in London, but how much scope is there for that to actually happen? That's just my question.
Thank you very much, Ros. And finally, Richard, and I'll go back to our speakers.
Hi, thanks. Just one observation on culture change. I'm Richard Orchesky, Labour and Co-op councillor in Camden. In terms of Camden's housing, we have issues with damp and mould like everyone else, but we are very clear not to blame tenants for that, and that you have to look at the deeper reasons for housing conditions, etc., why that comes to pass. So don't despair. There are pockets where we're trying to change the culture on this. I've just got one very brief question. The speakers talked about priorities and so on, which was really helpful. We're obviously all hoping that we'll pretty soon have a Labour government, and I wonder if out of the various priorities you talked about, if there's one thing that a new incoming Labour government could do, what would that be? What would be the first thing it should do that would be of help?
Thank you, Richard. I'll pass over to Blase first, then pass to Rachel after.
Thank you. So firstly, picking up on the bunker example in the Public Works Loan Board, yeah, I mean, the 1974 Local Government Act gives powers to public bodies to dispose of land and other public assets. It also gives power for them to dispose of what's called less than best consideration, in other words, less than market price. Now, quite often when I talk to local authorities, particularly their senior finance officers, the initial response is, oh no, we're not allowed to do that, or oh, we have to get the Secretary of State's permission to do that. Well, the regulations relating to this state that any undervaluation of £2 million or less can be decided upon at the discretion of the local authority. So local authorities most certainly could be making available small infill sites, either at no value or an undervaluation up to £2 million of full market value without having to get any approval from Secretary of State on that. They could be turning that land over to community land trusts. They could be turning that land over directly to cooperatives or co-housing projects. So that is all doable as things currently stand. What is affordable housing? Yeah, great question. I hear this a lot. Affordable housing on the one hand is a definition of rent levels defined by the government of the day. affordable housing on another definition is what's affordable to a particular area in terms of local people and their needs. But it is a rather hackneyed term that means so many different things to so many different people. Housing associations, what can be done about ever increasingly large housing associations becoming more distant from their tenants and meaningful tenant control? Well, for example, we could extend the right to manage provisions beyond local authority housing. At the moment, tenants and leaseholders in local authority housing can set up their own management cooperatives and take over the management of their services. They can't in housing associations. So a simple change to the law there to extend that right to housing associations would make a world of difference. At the same time, extending the right to transfer regulations to enable cooperatives to form to take transfer of ownership of housing association estates and properties would be a real step forward. In terms of the tax haven money in London, well, that's the point, yeah, I was touching on in terms of restricting speculative flows of money into places like central London and Manchester. We could do that if the will existed at government level to either restrict that or to change the tax regime relating to it. So again, you know, strong public policy and change in that direction could make a change there. And finally, the question that said, what would be the first thing that I would advise a Labour and co-op government to do when it came through the door? I come back to the presumption in favour issue. If there were a presumption in favour, like there is in Switzerland, for example, that land first of all gets offered for community use and cooperative venture, that would be a game changer for us.
Thank you very much, Blase. Rachel, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. I'll do them in reverse order, but I'll start off by saying, you know, Blase is absolutely right in terms of there is no housing associations are very much not cooperatives, and it's no replacement having tenants on boards. I think the point that I am making is there is currently no requirement for there to be any tenant or resident representation on housing association boards in a way that it used to be best practice as established by the Tenant Services Authority, which was abolished by the Conservative government, but is now bits of it are being sort of replaced within a new regulatory system. But Blase is right. I didn't want you to think I was sort of conflating these two, but I think it's worth making the point that the tenant representation and that community engagement has been eroded as part of the regulatory regime over the last 12, 13 years. In terms of the first thing, gosh, there's so many little things, but I think the overarching thing for affordable housing, and I'll come on to a definition of that, is just a stable public investment approach, which doesn't have different bodies having these stop-start approaches to bringing forward schemes that would give certainty to co-ops, to housing associations, to local authorities about where that support from central government would come from. And it's that stable security. You know, we've been hearing a lot about levelling up and this culture of local authorities and communities having to bid against each other. A stable approach to this, I think, would be much healthier and better overall for the delivery of genuinely affordable homes. In terms of Ros's question, Ros's three questions. So what does it mean by affordable? That will, as Blase said, this now basically comes down to definitions within local plans and local authorities. It's been, gosh, it's nearly it's over 10 years since the word affordable was first undermined with the introduction of affordable rent, which is 80% of market rent. And my goodness, we're going to spend even longer than 10 years, I think, recovering from that damage to that definition. In London, we have something called London affordable rent, which is equivalent to a new social rent or a new council rent levels, but rent levels, even within all sorts of different social sectors, are now completely different. And I can't help but remember when I first started working in this sector, there was a proposals around looking at different rent levels across different landlords, because they are all now so different, and it's very different to compare them between different social landlords. Belonging to a big housing association, I mean, I don't know which particularly large housing association you're part of, but I've spent a huge amount of my time as a local representative making the case that lots of housing associations seem to have become too big to really have that close community connection. And I think the governance of those housing associations has something to do with it. There's small, it used to be called community gateway housing associations that were part of small stock transfers that had not, again, to acknowledge Blase's point, not a cooperative approach, but very much a community-led approach that have now been absorbed into much larger housing associations. They're driven to do that because of the financing regulations around the new build. I think the way to hold them really to account is by pursuing and campaigning for, as I've said, community and resident representation on boards, but also forcing more and campaigning for more community representation at a smaller level. I'm afraid I can't think of a particularly good example, but I will go away and have a think, and perhaps that can be circulated. And Roz, I don't know whether you're in a London CLP, but it's certainly something that I have campaigned on within the cities of London and Westminster around economic crime and the role of dirty money within property. It's a big issue in the constituency I'm seeking to represent. The economic crime bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, I think, needs further powers around taking action on third-party enablers of this, and that's a key campaigning issue, but also powers for local authorities and public regulators to take action at the moment. I think that could be strengthened within the bill. And all I would say about local authorities I was just going to say what Blase said about local authorities gifting land, but that I do think it needs to remain a local decision, and giving those powers to local communities.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Just take two more questions, and just in the interest of time, if John and Jodie, who are coming in now, if you could just make your questions very brief, just because we need to wrap up by 7. Thank you.
Thank you, John Goodman here from Coventry and Rugby.
Oh, you've gone back on mute, John.
On mute. Right. Is that it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, a couple of quick points and a question which I've actually put in the chat to you, Daniel. First point is that supporting the Public Works Loan Board point. I've just been reading, I'm reviewing for Co-op News Andrew Bibby's new book on the co-partnership co-op societies in the first decade of the 20th century. They were mostly 75% funded by the Public Works Loan Board on long-term loans. So this is a well-established way of doing it and needs to be extended now. My second point is to you really, Daniel. I'm about to go off to our CLP discussion on the new Labour Party National Policy Forum papers. We've got 8 CLPs in our Co-op Party branch. I would like Co-op Party centrally to send all the branches a briefing note on co-op housing, so that when we go to these consultation events in our CLPs, and we've got a month to do it, we can all be presenting a coordinated set of proposals around the extension of cooperative housing. That seems an obvious channel for the party to go down. And my question really, which is to Blase, is around existing housing co-ops. How do we, it's exciting to hear about the Brighton one and the Camden one, but I think they're minorities. Most housing co-ops are not that enthusiastic about expanding and developing new homes. How could we and a Labour and co-op government sort of facilitate and catalyse and incentivise the existing housing co-op movement to become much more outward looking and a kind of develop new cooperative homes and expand the sector from the existing base?
Thanks, John. Jodie, I'm just going to come to you, and please be very brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think my question is about in times when we've obviously stretched with training, staff hours, finances, and everything, and kind of the erosion, as you've already mentioned about the legislation. How can we convince councils to take the plunge and take the risk? And you know, where are the initial? How can we get the initial funding, and what's to gain for councils financially?
Thank you, Jodie. I'm going to say, I think John's question was more to Blase. So if you want to answer that, Blase, and then Rachel, I think you'd be perfectly placed to answer Jodie's one. So I'll come to you after.
You're right, John. Good to see you. What I would say, I mean, I very much agree that many of the existing housing cooperatives are very risk averse. And, you know, they were set up a long time ago. They have their own housing stock. Nobody ever thought that it would be a good idea to write into their rules the idea that they should seek to enable the creation of future housing cooperatives. Most of these co-ops were developed, as I say, from 1974 onwards, when there was 100% grant funding for developing these types of homes. So people didn't write into the governing documents and create the culture within organisations that they should see themselves as investors, as enablers of future cooperative development and growth. And I think what government needs to do by creating the right type of regulatory and financial intermediary environment is encourage cooperatives to start seeing that type of outward looking approach as something that on the one hand is a win for them because they're enabling new co-ops, on the other hand is a win for them because they can potentially get better returns than they're getting at the moment by having large sums of money sitting in high street banks earning them nothing. But I think much in the same way, I'll very quickly give the example of the Housing Finance Corporation, which enters into the bond market to borrow on behalf of small housing associations. It batches up the needs of them and goes and borrows for multiple organisations at once. And I said to the person who heads that organisation, well, how did you ever start this up from scratch with no assets, no track record? How come people suddenly started taking it seriously? And he said, well, the Prime Minister of the day walked into the city and said, I'm behind this organisation, back it. And clear and strong government messages don't half move obstructions. So I think very clear and strong government policy in this area to start freeing up the ability for the sector to grow itself would be really helpful.
Thank you very much, Blase. And I'm just going to come to Rachel just to finish off.
Really quickly, in terms of how to make the case with local authorities, I think what's come through is what the gaps are and what needs to happen under a Labour and co-op government, but also what the potential is now. I think at a really practical level, understanding local planning requirements and being clear about what the actual model would be in any particular development. I don't know if you're thinking about one where you live, but understanding how many of the homes would be rented co-op or owned co-op will make a real difference, because that means when you first go into to talk about these ideas, you're being really clear on some of the financing and whether or not a potential scheme meets a local plan and local planning requirements. And then I do think it's also worth building up partnerships between different co-ops and different organisations that can share risk, but also demonstrate a strength of business model to make sure that the approach is sustainable. I think that can be quite effective.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Thank you. I'm going to wrap up now because we've hit 7 o'clock. All I want to say is thanks very much to our speakers for some really fantastic presentations and responses in the Q&A. And thank you all for attending this evening for this event. It was really, really interesting discussion. Please do keep an eye out for our upcoming Cooperation Lives, which will be carrying on throughout the spring. And it would also be great to see as many of you as possible in person at our regional conferences, which are ongoing at this moment in time. So thank you very much all for attending this evening. I hope to see you all soon. All the best.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.